Hello, and welcome back. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me here tonight. It is time to set aside the cares of your day, to let the noise of the present moment fade into the background, and to allow your mind to drift to a quieter, slower place. Tonight, we are going to begin a very special journey. Over the next several nights, we will follow the life of a single man, a man who lived more than 2,000 years ago, yet whose shadow still falls across the way we think, the way we speak, and the way we understand our world. His name was Aristotle. But before he was a philosopher, before he was a teacher of kings, and before he was a legend, he was simply a boy. Our story tonight is not about grand theories or complex logic. It is about beginnings. It is about a child growing up on the edge of the known world, learning to look, learning to listen, and learning to understand the quiet rhythms of nature. So close your eyes, let the darkness of the room wrap around you like a warm blanket, and let us travel back, across the centuries, to the shores of the Aegean Sea. The year is 384 BCE. Our story opens in a small, quiet harbor town called Stagira. It was not a grand city like Athens with its marble temples glowing in the sun, nor was it a fortress like Sparta. Stagira was a humble place, a colony resting on the eastern coast of the Chalcidides Peninsula, a rugged finger of land pointing out into the deep, rhythmic waters of the Aegean. To the south lay the brilliant, loud world of the Greek city-states. To the north lay the wild, forested mountains of the kingdom of Macedon. Aristotle was born right here, in the breathing space between these two worlds. From his very first moments, he was a creature of the borderlands. He belonged to the sea, and he belonged to the mountains, but he never fully belonged to just one place. He was born to be an observer, standing on the threshold, watching the world turn. Imagine the sensory world of his childhood. The air in Stagira was thick with the scent of pine resin from the forests and the sharp, clean tang of salt from the sea. The days were marked not by clocks, but by the movement of the sun across the sky and the changing colors of the water, from turquoise at noon to a deep, wine-dark purple at twilight. Aristotle's father was named Nicomachus, and Nicomachus was a man of deep learning and steady hands. He served as the personal court physician to King Amyntas III of Macedon. In the ancient world, being a physician was not merely a job, it was a calling, a sacred craft passed down from father to son within a guild, the Asclepiads. We must imagine the young Aristotle not sitting in a schoolroom, but standing in his father's workshop. Picture a room that is cool and dim, a sanctuary from the bright Mediterranean heat. The walls are lined with shelves holding ceramic jars, each one filled with the roots, powders, and dried leaves used to heal. The air here smells of sage, mint, honey, and iron. In this quiet room, the boy watched his father work. While other philosophers of the era were looking up at the heavens, trying to find truth in the abstract patterns of the stars, Aristotle was learning to look down. He was learning to look at the earth. His father taught him that reality is not an abstract idea. Reality is physical. It is wet, warm, fragile, and alive. From Nicomachus, Aristotle learned the art of observation. He learned that to understand a living thing, whether it is a starfish found in a tide pool or the human body itself, you must look with patience. You must examine the parts to understand the whole. He learned to trace the veins in a leaf. He learned to listen to the rhythm of a heartbeat. He learned that nature does nothing in vain. Every curve of a bone, every feather on a bird has a purpose. This was the great gift of his childhood, the empirical eye, the belief that truth is hidden right here in the matter of the world, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. Because of his father's high position, Aristotle's childhood was also touched by the grandeur of royalty. He spent time at the Macedonian court in Pella, a place of horsemen and hunters. He likely played in the shadow of the palace, perhaps even crossing paths with a young prince named Philip, who would one day become a king and father to Alexander the Great. He saw the workings of power not as a theory, but as a reality of men and influence. But this golden season of learning and security was destined to end. The ancient world was beautiful, but it was also fragile. Fortune could shift like the winds that whipped across the peninsula. Before Aristotle could reach full manhood, the quiet safety of his life was broken. History does not record the exact details. The grief is hidden behind the veil of centuries. But we know that while he was still just a boy, both of his parents died. The workshop fell silent. The jars of herbs gathered dust. The connection to the royal court was severed. The boy who had been trained to heal was left alone with the silence of loss. He was an orphan in a world where family was the only true protection. He was taken in by a guardian, a man named Proxenus of Atarneus, who was likely an uncle or an older relative. Proxenus was kind, and he was observant. He looked at the boy and saw that he was not meant for a life of trade or farming. He saw a mind that was vast, hungry, and dangerously sharp. He saw a spark that needed a different kind of fuel. And so, as Aristotle stood on the cliffs of Stagira, looking out over the endless blue water, he found himself at a crossroads. He was no longer just the physician's son. He was a young man with a modest inheritance, a brilliant mind, and no anchor. The sea breeze tugged at his cloak, whispering of distant places. The first chapter of his life, the chapter of the family, the workshop, and the healing arts, had closed. The next chapter would require a journey. It would require him to leave the forests and the sea spray of the north. He would have to sail south toward a city that was whispered about in every corner of the Mediterranean, a city of light, of stone, and of words, a city called Athens. Imagine the sensation of that voyage. Aristotle is 17 years old. He stands on the deck of a wooden ship, feeling the rise and fall of the swell beneath his feet. The air is cool and filled with the fine mist of salt spray. Above him, the great white sails snap softly in the wind, driving the vessel south, away from the forests of his youth and toward the heart of the Greek world. For days there is only the horizon, the place where the pale blue of the sky meets the deep indigo blue of the water. It is a vast, open space where a young mind can drift, untethered from the past, moving steadily toward a future he cannot yet see. The year is 367 BCE. His destination is Athens. In the ancient world, Athens was more than just a gathering of buildings. It was an idea. It was a city of light, of white marble temples rising from the rock, of theater, and of endless conversation. As the ship finally docked at the Piraeus, the great bustling port of the city, Aristotle stepped into a world of overwhelming sensation. The air here smelled different. It smelled of dried figs, of imported timber, of hot dust, and of the sea. The sounds were louder here, the shouting of fishmongers, the clatter of chariot wheels on stone, and the babble of 100 different dialects from across the Mediterranean. But Aristotle moved through this noise like a ghost. You see, in Athens, he was known as a metic, a resident alien. Although he came from a wealthy family and carried himself with dignity, he had no political rights here. He could not vote in the assembly. He could not own the land beneath his feet. He was a guest in the house of democracy. This legal distance suited him perfectly. It reinforced what he had always been since his childhood in Stagira, the watcher, the one who stands slightly apart. While the citizens of Athens hurried about their business, arguing in the courts and trading in the markets, Aristotle walked slowly through the streets. His eyes took in everything, the geometry of the architecture, the customs of the people, the way the light fell on the statues of the gods, cataloging the city just as he had once cataloged the sea creatures in the tide pools of home. He was looking for a specific place. He turned away from the noise of the market and the harbor. He walked out of the city gates about a mile to the northwest until the dust of the road gave way to grass and shade. He came to a grove of olive trees. The leaves were silver green, shimmering in the gentle Attic breeze, casting dappled patterns of light and shadow on the dry earth. The air here was filled with the dry, rasping song of cicadas. This was the Grove of Academus, a place sacred to Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And nestled within these trees was a community that would change the course of history. It was the Academy. It was not a university as we might imagine one today. There were no grand lecture halls, no rigid schedules, no bells ringing the hour. It was a brotherhood, a gathering of souls dedicated to a single quiet pursuit, the understanding of reality. At the center of this garden stood a man of 60. His name was Plato. He was a broad-shouldered man with a white beard and eyes that seemed to look right through the physical world. He had dedicated his life to the belief that the things we see with our eyes, the tables and chairs, the dogs and horses, are merely shadows. For Plato, the true world was a world of eternal forms, perfect and unchanging, accessible only to the mind. Into this sanctuary of abstract thought walked Aristotle. Picture him then as he enters the grove. He was distinct. Accounts tell us he was somewhat of a dandy, perhaps overcompensating for his status as a foreigner. He wore rings on his fingers, his hair was cut short in a fashionable style, and his cloak was of fine quality. He spoke with a slight lisp, a softness in his voice that required you to lean in to hear him. He brought with him the memory of the dissecting table. While the academy looked to mathematics and geometry to find the divine, Aristotle brought the perspective of the physician's son. He brought the belief that truth could be found in the physical, living thing, in the shell of a snail or the feather of a bird. It was a meeting of two different kinds of genius, the mystic and the scientist, the man who looked up and the boy who looked down. But despite their differences, a profound connection formed almost immediately. Plato looked at this 17-year-old northerner, this quiet observer with the intense dark gaze, and he saw a brilliance that matched his own. He didn't see a barbarian from the north, he saw a successor. Plato soon gave him a name. He called him the mind of the school. And so, Aristotle's new life began. For the next 20 years, a span of time that turns a youth into a middle-aged man, he would remain here, walking beneath those silver olive trees. The days would turn into seasons, the seasons into years. The summer sun would bake the earth, and the winter rains would turn the paths to mud. But the conversation in the garden would never stop. It was a time of immense intellectual incubation. He was safe here. He was sheltered from the storms of politics and the grief of his orphanhood. Here, in the long golden afternoons of Athens, Aristotle began to read. He collected scrolls like treasures, devouring history, astronomy, and poetry, slowly building a cathedral of knowledge inside his own mind. He had found his sanctuary. He had found his place in the shade. But as the years drifted by, the differences between the master and the student would begin to grow, like a root pushing slowly through stone. But that unfolding is a story for the next part of our journey. For now, let us leave him there, walking in the cool shade of the olive trees, a scroll in his hand, surrounded by the quiet hum of wisdom. For 20 years, Aristotle remained in that garden. 20 years. It is a span of time that is difficult to fully grasp. It is the time it takes for a sapling to become a shade tree. It is the time it takes for a young man with a lisp and a fashionable cloak to become a scholar of deep, seasoned authority. We often think of school as a place we pass through, a few years of study before real life begins. But for Aristotle, the academy was not a pause in life. It was life. It was a world unto itself, a quiet island of time where the days were measured not by the accumulation of wealth, but by the accumulation of understanding. Imagine the routine of those days, the morning light filtering through the olive leaves, casting long, thin shadows across the marble floors of the porticos, the sound of sandals on stone as the members of the brotherhood gathered. They did not sit in rows to memorize facts. They walked. They moved. They believed that the mind worked best when the body was in motion. Aristotle walked with them. He walked with Plato. It is easy to imagine them as rivals, the old master and the brilliant student locked in endless conflict. But the truth is softer and more complex. For 2 decades, Aristotle was Plato's most devoted champion. He absorbed the master's teachings like the dry earth absorbs the rain. He learned to construct arguments like an architect constructs a temple, stone by stone, pillar by pillar, until the structure could support the weight of the truth. But Aristotle brought something new to this garden of speech. He brought a love for the written word. In the ancient world, wisdom was largely a spoken thing. It was alive in the air and the breath of the speaker. But Aristotle was different. He began to collect scrolls. He bought them, traded for them, and commissioned copies of them. In his private quarters, he built one of the first great private libraries in history. Picture him there, in the quiet of the evening, when the debates of the day had faded into silence. A single oil lamp burns on his desk, casting a warm, golden circle of light. The smell of papyrus and old leather fills the room. While the rest of Athens slept, Aristotle sat unrolling the thoughts of men who had died centuries before. He read histories, plays, medical treatises, and astronomical charts. He was systematizing human knowledge, building a cathedral of facts inside his own mind. Plato, seeing this voracious appetite for texts, gave him another nickname. He called him the Reader. It was a title of respect, acknowledging a new kind of intellect, one that looked not just to the inspiration of the moment, but to the recorded memory of the past. During these long, golden years, years that scholars call his apprenticeship in the shade, Aristotle began to find his own voice. He began to write. And what he wrote was not the dry, dense lecture notes that we have today. No, in his youth, Aristotle wrote dialogues. He wrote conversations that flowed with grace and elegance. Later Roman writers who had read these lost works described his style as a river of gold. He wrote about the soul. He wrote about justice. He wrote about the stars. He was a poet of ideas, using language to paint pictures of the cosmos. But as the years turned, a subtle shift began to occur. A slow, quiet divergence, like a branch growing away from the trunk of a tree to find its own patch of sunlight. It began with the question of where truth lives. Plato taught that if you want to understand a thing, say a horse, you should not look at the horse in the stable. That horse is imperfect. It grows old, it gets sick, it dies. Instead, Plato said, you should close your eyes and contemplate the form of the horse, the perfect, eternal idea of a horse that exists in a heavenly realm. Aristotle tried to follow this path. He loved his teacher, but he could not forget the lessons of his father's workshop. He could not forget the dissecting table. Aristotle looked at the horse in the stable, and he saw truth there too. He saw the way its teeth were shaped for eating grass. He saw the way its hooves were built for speed. He began to argue, gently at first, that the form does not live in some distant heaven. It lives inside the creature. The form is its function. The form is its purpose. He began to realize that the physical world, the world of mud and water, of blood and bone, was not a trap to be escaped. It was a book to be read. He turned his eyes to the city of Athens itself. He watched the politicians swaying the crowds in the assembly. He analyzed their speeches not with the disdain of a mystic, but with the curiosity of a scientist. He broke down the art of persuasion into its parts: logic, emotion, and character. He began to teach rhetoric, showing the younger students that speech was a tool, like a chisel or a scalpel, that could be used for good or ill. He was becoming his own man. He was 37 years old now. His hair was thinning, his eyes were sharper, and his mind was fully formed. The academy was still his home, but the walls were beginning to feel small. The master, Plato, was now 80 years old, a giant of a man approaching the end of his long day. The sun was setting on one era of philosophy, and the first stars of a new era were beginning to appear in the sky. Aristotle was ready. He had read the books, he had learned the arguments, he had walked the paths, and he was beginning to understand that his destiny lay not in the shadow of another, but in the light of his own lamp. The long apprenticeship was drawing to a close. The world outside the garden was waiting. As the years stretched on, the difference between the master and the student became a palpable thing in the air of the academy. It was not a loud conflict. There were no shouting matches beneath the olive trees. Instead, it was a quiet, inevitable separation, like the moment a ripe fruit finally separates from the branch that bore it.
The saying that has come down to us through the centuries is simple: I love Plato, but I love the truth more. It captures the essence of this season of Aristotle's life. He had spent 2 decades absorbing the mysticism of Plato, the belief that the real world was hidden behind a veil. But as Aristotle matured, his physician's eyes began to assert themselves. He simply could not deny the reality of the world in front of him. Plato pointed up. He looked at the stars and saw perfect geometry. He believed that the messiness of life, the mud, the hair, the changing seasons, was a distraction from the eternal. Aristotle pointed forward. He looked at the world and saw a magnificent, orderly machine. He realized that if you want to understand what a good oak tree is, you don't dream of a perfect tree in heaven. You look at the acorn. You look at the soil. You look at the way the roots drink the water. You look at the process of becoming. This was the great divergence. Aristotle began to dismantle the theory of forms, not out of malice, but out of necessity. He began to ask the hard questions. If there is a perfect form of a man in heaven and a physical man on earth, do we need a third form to explain the similarity between them, and then a fourth to explain that? It was a logic that spiraled into infinity.
He realized that truth was not something you remembered from a past life, as Plato taught. Truth was something you discovered, piece by categorizing the universe. Substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time. Aristotle was building a grid, a vast mental filing cabinet in which every single thing in the cosmos had its proper place. And then the inevitable happened. The clock of mortality finally ran out for the master. In the year 347 BCE, Plato died. He was 80 years old. He had defined philosophy for 3 generations. The silence in the grove of Academus must have been profound. The great voice that had challenged Athens, that had woven myths of caves and chariots, was stilled. And in that silence, a question hung heavy in the air. Who would lead them now? By every measure of merit, the choice was obvious. Aristotle was the mind of the school. He was the most brilliant thinker, the most prolific writer, the most dedicated student. In a world governed by pure reason, the mantle would have fallen to him. But Athens was not governed by pure reason. It was governed by laws and by bloodlines. The leadership of the academy passed to Speusippus. He was not the brightest mind in the garden. He was a mathematician of decent ability, but he lacked the fire of genius. His primary qualification was simple. He was Plato's nephew. He was family. And he was an Athenian citizen. Aristotle was neither. After 20 years of service, after pouring his youth and his intellect into the institution, he was reminded of the hard, cold fact that he was still a metic. He was still a resident alien. He could not legally own the buildings of the school. And with anti-Macedonian sentiment rising in Athens due to the military expansions of King Philip in the north, Aristotle's northern roots were becoming a liability. So, at the age of 37, Aristotle found himself unmoored once again. The grief of losing his teacher was compounded by the sting of rejection. The home he had built for himself, the library he had curated, the routine of the walks and the lectures, it was all slipping away. He was too proud to serve under a lesser mind, and too wise to stay where he was no longer welcome. He made the decision to leave. Imagine the packing of that library, the rolling of the scrolls, the careful placement of the wooden cases into trunks. These were not just books, they were the external hard drive of his genius, the sum total of 20 years of thought. He walked out of the city gates of Athens, the city of light that had been his home for half his life. He walked down to the harbor at Piraeus, just as he had done as a hopeful 17-year-old boy. But the man who boarded the ship this time was different. He was heavier in spirit, sharper in mind, and utterly alone in his intellectual mission. He was not sailing home to Stagira. That life was gone. Instead, he set his course east across the Aegean, toward the coast of Asia Minor. He was heading for a city called Assos. He was homeless again, but he was also free. The shadow of the great oak tree was gone, and for the first time,
Aristotle stood in the full, unblocked light of the sun. He was about to step onto a new shore where he would find not just a new home, but the two things he had been missing for so long: authority and love. But the story of the lagoon and the woman who would capture the heart of the logician is a tale for the next part of our journey. The year is 347 BCE. Aristotle is sailing east toward the coast of Asia Minor to what is now modern-day Turkey. Imagine the arrival. The ship navigates the coastal waters, the deep blue of the Aegean giving way to the rocky, imposing shoreline. Ahead of him arises the city of Assos. It is a dramatic place, perched high on the slopes of an extinct volcano. The city walls are built of dark volcanic stone, standing stark and strong against the bright Mediterranean sky. To look out from those walls is to see the island of Lesbos floating in the distance, a purple haze on the horizon. Aristotle stepped off the ship not as a student and not as a reject, but as a guest of honor. He had been invited here by a man named Hermias, and Hermias was one of the most fascinating figures of the ancient world. He had begun his life as a slave, a man with no name and no future. Through intelligence and force of will, he had risen to become a wealthy banker and then the ruler, the tyrant, of the city-states of Atarneus and Assos. But Hermias was not a typical tyrant. He had a hunger for something more than power. He hungered for wisdom. He had studied at the academy in Athens years before, and he had never forgotten the taste of philosophy. When he heard that Aristotle had left Athens, he sent word immediately, "Come to me. Help me rule with wisdom." For Aristotle, stepping into the court of Hermias must have been a balm for his wounded pride. In Athens, he was a resident alien, unable to vote, living on the sufferance of the locals. Here, in Assos, he was the master. He was the most important man in the city next to the ruler himself. Hermias gave Aristotle the city of Assos as a place to live and teach. He provided him with resources, with a home, and most importantly, with respect. It was here that Aristotle began to gather his own circle. He was no longer the brilliant student challenging Plato from the back of the room. He was now the center of the conversation. He was joined by other refugees from the academy, friends like Xenocrates, and soon a native of the nearby island of Lesbos named Theophrastus, a man who would become his dearest friend and lifelong collaborator. Imagine the atmosphere of this new school. It was smaller than the academy, more intimate. They met in the high citadel of the city, looking out over the sea. The air was cooler here than in the stifling heat of Athens. The wind smelled of wild thyme and oregano from the hillsides. Here, the conversations began to change. They stopped talking so much about abstract mathematics and eternal forms. They began to talk about the world around them. They talked about how a city should be governed, not in an ideal utopia, but in the real world of messy politics and human ambition. They talked about the plants growing in the cracks of the volcanic rock. They talked about the animals grazing in the valleys below. For the first time, Aristotle was intellectually free. There was no giant shadow of Plato to stand in. He could stretch his mind in any direction he chose. It was a time of deep, healing friendship. In the evenings, after the sun had dipped below the western sea, these men would gather for the symposium, the drinking party that was the heart of Greek social life. But these were not rowdy affairs. They were meetings of minds. They lay on couches, cups of wine diluted with water in their hands, solving the riddles of the universe while the stars wheeled overhead. Aristotle was happy here. The sting of Athens faded. He realized that wisdom did not belong to a single city. It belonged to anyone with the patience to seek it. But Assos offered him something else, something he had not expected. Hermias had a niece, or perhaps an adopted daughter, named Pythias. She was younger than Aristotle, but she lived in this world of high culture and deep thought. We know very little about their courtship. The ancient writers did not record the small glances, the conversations in the garden.
the gradual turning of respect into affection. But we know the result. The man of logic, the man who categorized the universe into substances and qualities, fell in love. And so, on this high rock overlooking the sea, Aristotle found the two things that anchor a human life: work that has meaning and a person to share it with. He married Pythias. It was the beginning of a brief, beautiful season of domestic peace. The wanderer had found a home, the orphan had found a family, and the philosopher had found a laboratory, a vast, living world waiting to be explored just across the water on the island of Lesbos. The happiness Aristotle found in Assos was profound, but like all things in the ancient world, it was fragile. He had a home, a circle of brilliant friends, and a new wife, Pythias. But the geopolitical tectonics were shifting beneath their feet. The Persian Empire, the great giant to the east, was stirring. Hermias, the philosopher king and Aristotle's patron, was caught in the middle. He had been secretly negotiating with King Philip of Macedon, hoping to forge an alliance against the Persians. But the secret was betrayed. A Greek mercenary commander, lured by Persian gold, captured Hermias under a flag of truce and sent him in chains to the Persian capital of Susa. The news shattered the peace of the philosophical circle. Aristotle knew that anyone connected to Hermias was now in grave danger. The idyll on the cliffs was over. He packed his library once again. He gathered Pythias, his new bride, and his closest friend, Theophrastus. They did not have to travel far, just across a narrow strip of glittering water to the large island visible from the ramparts of Assos, the island of Lesbos. They settled in the city of Mytilene, but Aristotle's true destination was a place of quieter magic. On the western side of the island lay a vast inland body of water known as the Lagoon of Pyrrha. Imagine this place. It was a shallow, sheltered gulf, protected from the rough winds of the open sea. The water was warm and teeming with life. Reeds rustled along the banks, and birds waded in the shallows. It was here, in this natural laboratory, that Aristotle would conduct the work that truly separated him from every thinker who had come before him. In Athens, at the Academy, they had studied the heavens. They had looked at the stars and seen perfect mathematical circles. They had believed that truth was found only in the eternal and the unchanging. But here, knee-deep in the mud of the lagoon, Aristotle found a different kind of truth. He found the truth of life. For 2 years, the great philosopher became a beachcomber. He spent his days talking to fishermen, asking them about the migratory patterns of tuna, the mating habits of catfish, and the life cycles of sponges. He did not consider this work beneath him. To Aristotle, the divine was present in even the humblest creature. He wrote, "We must not betake ourselves to the consideration of the meaner animals with a bad grace, as though we were children, since in all natural things there is something of the marvelous." Picture him there, the sun beating down on his back, holding a sea urchin in his hand. He examined it with an intensity no one had ever applied to such a creature before. He mapped the internal structure of its mouth, a complex arrangement of 5 calcium plates that allowed it to scrape algae from rocks. To this day, biologists call this structure Aristotle's lantern. He watched the cuttlefish and the octopus. He observed that when they mated, one of the male's arms would change shape, becoming a delivery mechanism for life. It was an observation so specific and strange that for centuries, later scientists thought he had made it up. It wasn't until the 19th century that marine biologists rediscovered the hectocotylus arm and realized Aristotle had been right all along. He dissected the dogfish shark and discovered something incredible. The embryo was attached to the mother by a cord, fed by a placenta, just like a mammal. It was a detail that shattered the simple categories of fish and beast. This was the birth of biology. Before this moment, people had looked at animals as food, or as symbols and myths, or as omens from the gods. Aristotle looked at them as beings with a telos, a purpose. He saw that every part of an animal existed for the sake of something. The bird has wings in order to fly. The eye has a lens in order to see. Nature, he realized, was not random.
It was an artist. It was constantly working to realize potential, to turn matter into form. His friend Theophrastus worked beside him, but while Aristotle was fascinated with animals, creatures that moved and sensed, Theophrastus turned his eyes to the plants. They divided the living world between them. Theophrastus became the father of botany, categorizing the oaks and the reeds, while Aristotle became the father of zoology. It was a time of immense intellectual joy. You can feel it in his writings from this period. The dryness of logic gives way to a sense of wonder. He describes the delicate veins of a chick embryo on the third day of incubation, pulsing like a tiny red point of light. He describes the complex stomachs of ruminating animals. He was building a catalog of life, trying to hold the sheer variety of the world in his mind. And he was sharing this wonder with Pythias. We know little of her voice, but she was there, in the exile, in the discovery. They had a daughter, whom they also named Pythias. The domestic life of the philosopher was full of the cries of a child, the smell of the sea, and the endless, fascinating parade of living things. He might have stayed there forever, the naturalist on the island, cataloging the infinite variety of the lagoon. It was a peaceful life. It was a life of pure discovery. But the world of men has a way of interrupting the world of nature. Across the water, on the mainland, the king of Macedon had been watching. Philip II was not interested in sea urchins or starfish. He was interested in empire. And he had a son, a wild, unmanageable 13-year-old named Alexander, who needed a teacher. The quiet days in the lagoon were coming to an end. The summons was on its way. The philosopher was about to be called from the study of nature to the shaping of history.
In the year 343 BCE, a message arrived on the island of Lesbos. It bore the royal seal of Macedon. King Philip II, the most powerful man in Macedonia, had sent for the philosopher. The king wrote, "I have a son. For this I am grateful to the gods, not so much for the birth of the boy, but that he was born in your time." The boy's name was Alexander. He was 13 years old. History would one day call him the Great, but at this moment he was simply a prince, wild, golden-haired, and burning with an ambition that terrified even his father. Aristotle accepted the summons. He packed his specimens, his notes on the sea urchins and the birds, and sailed north. He was returning to the land of his childhood, but he was returning as a master. King Philip did not want his son educated in the noisy political capital of Pella. Instead, he assigned them a sanctuary. He gave them the precinct of the nymphs at Mysa, a village in the foothills of the mountains. Imagine this classroom. It was not a building of brick and mortar, but a garden. It was a place of cool, mossy caves and ancient trees. There were stone seats carved into the living rock, shaded by the thick canopy of leaves. A stream ran through the precinct, providing a constant, soothing background of running water. Here, in this green cathedral, the greatest mind of the ancient world met the greatest conqueror. It is one of history's most poetic pairings. On one side, Aristotle, the man of the golden mean, who believed that virtue lay in moderation, in balance, in the careful study of what is. On the other side, Alexander, the boy of excess, who believed in the heroic myths of old, who wanted to push beyond the limits of the known world. For 3 years they walked these garden paths together. Aristotle taught the prince not just facts, but how to see. He taught him ethics. He explained that a true king is not merely a man with a sword, but a man with a soul governed by reason. He taught that ruling over willing subjects is noble, while ruling over slaves is base. He taught him geography, drawing maps of the world in the dirt. He taught him medicine, passing on the secrets of his own father, Nicomachus. Alexander absorbed it all. Later in his life, even while on military campaigns, the king would find time to prescribe treatments for his sick friends, proud of the medical knowledge he had learned in the quiet groves of Mieza. But the most famous gift Aristotle gave his student was a book. Alexander loved Homer. He believed he was descended from Achilles, the hero of the Trojan War. Aristotle took the scroll of the Iliad and annotated it.
He made a copy specifically for the young prince with notes and explanations. This scroll became Alexander's most prized possession. It is said that he carried it with him all the way to India, sleeping with it under his pillow every night, right next to his dagger. The wisdom of the philosopher and the instrument of war resting side by side in the dark. Yet there was a quiet tension in the garden. Aristotle was a man of the city-state, the polis. He believed that human happiness could only be achieved in a small, self-governing community where citizens knew one another. He looked at the vast empires of the East, the Persians, and saw them as barbarians, people too servile to be truly free. Alexander, however, was dreaming of something else. He was dreaming of a world without borders. He did not want to stay in a small city-state. He wanted to swallow the horizon. He did not want to keep Greeks and non-Greeks separate. He would eventually try to blend them into a single people. The philosopher tried to plant roots. The prince wanted to be the wind.
But for this brief season, in the shade of the nymphs, there was a truce between thought and action. Aristotle opened the windows of the universe for the boy. He showed him the logic of the stars, the classification of animals, and the structure of an argument. He tried to tether the boy's wild spirit to the solid ground of reason. Virtue, Aristotle would say, is a habit. We are what we repeatedly do. Alexander listened. He respected his teacher profoundly, once saying that while his father had given him life, Aristotle had taught him how to live well. But the time for learning was short. When Alexander turned 16, King Philip marched away to war and left the boy as regent of the kingdom. The garden classroom fell silent. The stone seats were empty. The lesson was over. The lion had been educated, but he had not been tamed. Aristotle's work in the north was done. He was now nearly 50 years old. He had been a student, a researcher, a husband, and a tutor to royalty. His hair was turning gray. He had amassed a fortune and a reputation, but he had not yet built his own house. The world was changing. The Macedonian power he had served was about to sweep down and conquer all of Greece, including Athens. And in the wake of that conquest, the road to Athens would open up for him once more. It was time to return to the city of wisdom. It was time to stop teaching just one boy and to start teaching the world. The greatest phase of his life, the founding of the Lyceum, was about to begin. Aristotle had a different vision. He wanted to look at the earth. He needed a place that was open, a place that was connected to the pulse of the world. He found it just outside the city walls of Athens, in a public gymnasium dedicated to Apollo Lyceus, Apollo the wolf god. This place was called the Lyceum. Imagine this setting. It was not a quiet, enclosed garden like the academy. It was a place of activity. There were wrestling grounds where young men trained their bodies in the dust. There were groves of trees providing shade from the midday sun. And most importantly, there were covered walkways, colonnades of stone columns that offered shelter from the rain and the heat. Here, amidst the sounds of athletes and the rustling of the trees, Aristotle rented some buildings and established his school. It came to be known as the Peripatetic School. The name comes from the Greek word peripatos, which means a covered walkway or the act of walking about. Legend tells us that Aristotle did not like to sit still while he taught. He liked to move. He would pace up and down the colonnades, his hands gesturing, his robe swaying with his stride, while his students trailed behind him or walked by his side. Imagine the rhythm of those lectures. The sound of sandals slapping gently against the stone floor, the cadence of the philosopher's voice rising and falling with his steps. To Aristotle, thinking was not a static activity. It was a movement. It was a journey from not knowing to knowing. The Lyceum was more than just a school. It was the birth of the modern research university. In the academy, they had focused on mathematics and dialectic, pure thought. In the Lyceum, they focused on everything. Aristotle was not content to simply theorize. He wanted to catalog the universe. He possessed a hunger for facts that was insatiable. He turned his school into a massive engine for gathering information. He sent his students out like an army of intellects,
Go, he told them, look at the world, write it down, bring it back. They collected everything. They gathered the constitutions of 158 different city-states, analyzing how laws worked in the real world. They collected the histories of the dramatic arts, listing every play that had won a prize in Athens. They collected rocks. They collected folklore. They collected maps. The Lyceum became the home of the first great library in history. Picture a room in the complex filled with the smell of dry papyrus and cedar wood, shelves stacked high with scrolls, organized not by poetic whim, but by subject, biology here, politics there, rhetoric, physics. It was a place of order. Aristotle was the great classifier. He believed that if you could name a thing and put it in its proper category, you could understand it. He drew lines through the chaos of the world. He separated the study of plants from the study of animals, the study of the stars from the study of the weather. The routine of the school was rigorous but open. In the mornings, Aristotle would give his acroamatic lectures. These were technical, difficult discussions intended for his advanced students, the inner circle who were dedicating their lives to philosophy. They would walk and talk about logic, about the nature of being, about the physics of the cosmos. But in the evenings, the gates were thrown open. Aristotle would give his exoteric lectures. These were for the public. He would speak on rhetoric, on politics, on how to live a good life. He believed that knowledge should not be hoarded by a priesthood of the mind. It should be shared. He was democratizing wisdom. For 12 years this golden age lasted, while his former student, Alexander, was marching east, conquering cities and toppling empires with the sword. Aristotle remained in his walkway, conquering the realm of knowledge with his mind. It was a time of immense productivity. The notes from these lectures, dense, brilliant, and systematic, would become the books that formed the backbone of Western education for the next 2,000 years. He was happy here. He was the master of his own house, surrounded by eager minds, with the resources to pursue every question that sparked his curiosity. The wanderer had finally built a home that fit the size of his intellect. But as he paced the stone floors of the Lyceum, organizing the architecture of reality, he was doing more than just teaching. He was writing the operating system for the human mind. He was creating the very tools we use to think. The years between 335 and 323 BCE were a time of breathtaking productivity. As Alexander the Great marched his armies across the map, redrawing the borders of nations, Aristotle remained in Athens, redrawing the borders of knowledge. Imagine him in the colonnade of the Lyceum. The morning light is slanted and sharp. He is walking, always walking, his students pacing beside him. He is not just teaching them facts, he is teaching them how to organize the universe. He looked at the chaotic world, the arguments in the marketplace, the changing seasons, the behavior of animals, the movement of stars, and he saw that it could all be categorized. He saw that chaos could be turned into order if you had the right tools. And so, he invented the tools. He created a field of study we now call logic. Before Aristotle, people argued, and they persuaded, and they debated, but no one had ever written down the rules of how thinking actually works. Aristotle stripped language down to its bones. He discovered the syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. It sounds simple to us now, but at the time, it was a revelation. He showed that truth has a structure. He showed that if you start with the right premises and follow the right path, you will inevitably arrive at the truth. He handed humanity a compass for the mind, a way to navigate through the fog of confusion. But he didn't stop at logic. He turned his gaze inward to the human heart and the question of how to live. He wrote the Nicomachean Ethics, a book named after his son, Nicomachus, whom he loved dearly. In this work, he asked the most fundamental question of all: what is the goal of human life? His answer was a beautiful Greek word, eudaimonia. It is often translated as happiness, but that is too small a word. Happiness sounds like a fleeting feeling, a moment of laughter or joy.
Eudaimonia is deeper. It means flourishing. It means living in a way that fulfills your potential, just as an oak tree fulfills the potential of the acorn. He taught that this flourishing comes from virtue. But virtue, Aristotle said, is not a list of rules written in stone. It is not something you memorize. Virtue is a habit. We are what we repeatedly do, he is often quoted as saying. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Imagine the comfort in that thought. You do not have to be born perfect. You become brave by doing brave things. You become kind by doing kind things. You build your character brick by brick, action by action, just as a builder builds a house. He taught the doctrine of the golden mean. He said that every virtue sits in the middle between two extremes. Courage sits between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity sits between stinginess and wastefulness. The path of wisdom is the path of balance, of finding the center, of avoiding the extremes that tear life apart. He wrote about politics, famously declaring that man is by nature a political animal. By this, he meant that we are designed to live together. We are not solitary creatures like tigers or spiders. We need community. We need conversation. A human being alone, he said, is either a beast or a god, but not a man. We find our purpose in our connection to others. And he looked even further, beyond the human realm, to the very nature of existence itself. He wrote the Metaphysics. He asked what lies behind the movement of the universe. He looked at the stars wheeling overhead, the sun rising and setting, the endless cycle of birth and death, and he asked, what started it all? He concluded that there must be something eternal, something perfect, something that moves the universe without moving itself. He called it the unmoved mover. It was not a personal God who listens to prayers, but a supreme principle of pure thought, drawing the universe toward it by the sheer power of attraction and love. Day after day, scroll after scroll, the work poured out of him. He wrote about rhetoric, about poetry, about the physics of motion, about the dreams of sleepers. He was building a comprehensive map of reality, leaving no corner of existence dark or unexamined. For 12 years, the Lyceum hummed with this energy. It was a factory of wisdom. While the world outside was often violent and unpredictable, here, under the stone columns, there was order, there was clarity. There was the deep satisfaction of seeing how the pieces of the world fit together. Aristotle was now in his early 60s. He was the most famous scholar in the world. He had a family he loved, a school he had built, and a legacy that seemed secure. He had organized the chaos of the world into a system that made sense. But the one thing logic cannot predict is the volatility of human emotion. The one thing a syllogism cannot control is the turning tide of history. Far away in Babylon, the life of his greatest student was flickering out, and with the death of the king, the walls of safety around the philosopher were about to collapse. The grid of logic was about to be overwhelmed by the chaos of a mob. The final act of the drama was approaching. But the story of the last exile and the legacy that would outlast empires is a tale for our final night. The year is 323 BCE. It was a summer of stifling heat in Athens, and the air was thick with tension. Then a rumor arrived from the east, carried by exhausted messengers. At first, no one believed it. It seemed impossible, like saying the sun had fallen from the sky. But the rumor solidified into fact. In the distant city of Babylon, in a palace of gold and clay, Alexander the Great was dead. The man who had held the world in his iron grip was gone, and with his death, the order of the world fractured. In Athens, the reaction was immediate. For years, the city had chafed under Macedonian rule. Now that resentment exploded into rebellion. And in the center of the storm stood Aristotle. He was the teacher of the tyrant. He was the friend of the conquerors. He was the outsider who had prospered while Athens bowed.
The enemies of philosophy moved quickly. Just as they had done with Socrates decades earlier, they brought up a charge of impiety. They claimed that a hymn Aristotle had written years ago for his friend Hermias was inappropriate for a mortal man. It was a flimsy pretext, legal theater to mask a political purge. Aristotle was now 62 years old. His hair was white, his walk slower. He looked at the angry city, the place where he had taught and written and built his life's work. He remembered clearly what had happened to Socrates. He remembered the cup of hemlock in the prison cell.
Legend tells us he made a simple, calm declaration. I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy. He did not stay to fight a battle he could not win. He did not seek martyrdom. He chose instead a quiet dignity. He entrusted the Lyceum to his dearest friend Theophrastus, and he packed his bags one last time. He left Athens. He traveled north to the island of Euboea, to the city of Chalcis. There he had inherited a family estate from his mother. It was a return to his roots, a closing of the circle. The house in Chalcis was quiet. It looked out over the Euripus Street, where the tides are famous for their complex, shifting currents. It is fitting that the man who spent his life studying the motion of the natural world would spend his final days watching the water move. It was a solitary time, but not a lonely one. He was surrounded by his family. He was surrounded by the memory of a life lived fully. A year later, in 322 BCE, Aristotle fell ill. It was a stomach ailment, perhaps the same one that had troubled him for years. He did not recover. But before he passed into the silence, he wrote a will. And this document, which has survived the ravages of time, tells us more about the man than 1,000 treatises. It is not the will of a cold logician. It is the will of a man of deep heart. He gave careful instructions for the care of his children. He provided generously for Herpulus, the woman who had cared for him in his later years, ensuring she would have a home and security. And he remembered those who had served him. He ordered that his slaves should not be sold, but that when they came of age, they should be freed. And then a final, touching request. He asked that the bones of his first wife, Pythias, be moved and laid to rest beside him, just as she had asked. The scientist, the categorizer, the man of pure reason, wanted to be reunited with his love in the dark earth. And so the physician's son from Stagira closed his eyes. But the story does not end in the grave, because Aristotle left something behind. He left the lecture notes, the scrolls of logic, biology, ethics, and politics. For a time, these works were in danger. The story goes that they were hidden in a cellar to protect them from greedy kings, languishing in the dark for centuries, gathering dust and mold. But ideas this powerful cannot remain buried. They were rediscovered, they were edited, and then they began a new journey. They traveled to Rome, where they taught orators how to speak. They traveled to the deserts of the Middle East, where they were translated into Arabic and cherished by Muslim scholars who called him simply the first teacher. They traveled back to Europe in the Middle Ages, translated into Latin, where they became the foundation of the universities. They sparked the Renaissance. They laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution. Even today, 2.5 millennia later, we are still living in Aristotle's world. When a scientist classifies a new species, they are using his method. When a lawyer constructs a logical argument, they are using his tools. When we speak of potential or substance, when we talk about seeking the golden mean in our lives, or when we say that man is a political animal, we are speaking with his voice. He was the outsider who stood on the edge of the crowd, watching. And because he watched so carefully, because he wrote down what he saw with such precision and love, he became the teacher of us all. Now the lesson is over. The scrolls are rolled up and put away. The lamps in the Lyceum have been extinguished. The sea at Chalcis is calm. The olive trees are still. It is time for you to rest now. Let the logic and the arguments fade. Let the history drift away into the mist. You are safe. You are part of this great flowing river of life that Aristotle loved so much. Good night.